Assalamualaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Malay Heritage Centre for another round of our public lecture series on this rainy Saturday. Thanks for joining us when you could probably be doing something else. So today we are going to have a talk, a sharing session entitled Mapping the Silat Groups of Singapore. For those of you who might not know what Silat is, briefly speaking, Silat is a form of martial arts that is found in Southeast Asia. You can find different variants of it throughout, in Peninsular Malaysia, in Java, some areas of Thailand even, and the Philippines. So what some would describe as the Malay world is where you would find Silat. But of course, with globalization, Silat has also gone beyond the maritime Southeast Asia. You can find Westerners practicing the art form, especially in Germany and France. It's growing in popularity, as well as in the Americas. So we have Silat groups throughout Indonesia and Malaysia that are very well researched, and we can also perhaps find instructional videos on YouTube about Kali Majapahit, which is a form of Filipino martial arts. But when we look at Singapore, we know there are Silat groups here. However, I think in terms of researching and documenting on Silat groups, I think we have quite a huge gap. So we have with us today Dr. Effendy Abdul Hamid, who is a historian at the Department of Southeast Asia Studies. He is a historian of Southeast Asia, and his research interests include the study of the charms and Southeast Asian martial arts. So before I pass it on to him, I just want to give you a bit of history as to how this talk came about. In 2017, Dr. Effendy published the first book that traces the history of an important pencak silat group in Singapore entitled Silat Seni Gayong Pasak, Singapura, A Historical Legacy. The first book on Silat group in Singapore, ever. Okay? So quite surprising, 2017. So prior to this, books on pencak silat are focused on the history and culture of silat groups in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and in Brunei. Majority of these books are written in Malay or Bahasa Indonesia. So there are limited books on silat in the English language as it is. Right? So if you're a researcher on silat or Southeast Asian martial arts, then hopefully you read Malay or Bahasa Indonesia. Otherwise, it's going to be quite difficult for you to do your research. So there are also numerous articles by scholars on various aspects of Silat over recent years, which demonstrates a growing interest in understanding of pencak Silat. However, the focus again falls on groups in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei. Singapore Silat groups have so far been under-researched and under-documented. So this is a huge gap, right? Singapore marks its history from 1819. So from 1819 until today, there's only been one book on the Silat group, and we understand that Silat's been around in Singapore for a long time. So this is a huge gap, and Dr. Effendy hopes that it can be filled, if not by him alone, hopefully by him and the future generations of researchers. All right? So, noticing this gap in 2019, Dr. Effendy started a research project with a grant from National Heritage Board entitled Preserving Intangible Cultural Heritage, Documenting and Recording the History, Culture and Memory of Malay Martial Arts Group in Singapore. The objectives of this project are to preserve the histories of Malay martial groups of Singapore by documenting and recording their past, to provide more materials for research into Malay martial arts in Singapore and the region, and to further enhance our understanding of the historical and social development of Singapore and Singapore Malay society. So, his research project included interviews, and these are documented by video, right? Video interviews with Silat practitioners, gurus, on their respective histories, the philosophies of the groups, what are the unique Silat moves each group has, you know, what your signature killer moves, right? And a lot more, right? Their myths, their legends, etc., community memories and things like that. So his project, in a way, is a roadmap on the Silat group in Singapore. Right? He tried to identify and interview as many Silat groups as he could. Of course, you didn't manage to get everyone. You got most of them, I understand. Some were more willing than others to participate in this project. And his project, I believe, is paving the way for future researchers to continue building on from, right? Because this is the first time anyone has actually embarked on research on Silat groups. So today we have Dr. Effendy here with us to share some of his findings. And thank you, Dr. Effendy. See you again.
Okay, thank you, Jamal, for that really kind introduction. But let me start this lecture with, do I need to show this a scan thing? No, yeah? Oh, yeah.
Sorry, my bad. Yeah, it is still COVID, but we have audiences here and as well at home. So those of you who are here, you want to ask me a question, you can straight throw it at me. But if you want to remain anonymous, this is the Slido for it, right? If you don't want your question to be identified to you, then yeah, you can send this. For those of you at home, you can also send your questions through this QR code, and I will read it on my phone, all right? Okay.
Right, thank you. All right, so let's move on with the lecture. So I will be giving a lecture on this today, but before we start, I would like to show you a nice little trailer based on the project that Jamal has mentioned just now. Right, that's really, every time I watch that trailer, really is invigorating. It reminds me why I'm doing this real difficult work at all. All right, so you need these things to really encourage you along the way. So let me begin with thank you, Jamal, and the Malay Heritage Center for again giving me an opportunity to share my research with the public. And I would like to commend MHC's ongoing efforts to bridge academia to the public sphere. And it is a worthwhile endeavor for many reasons. Now, the topic today, entitled Mapping Silat Schools is based on the findings and reflections of a project entitled Preserving Intangible Cultures, Documenting and Recording the History and Culture and Memory of Malay Martial Art Groups in Singapore. Bit of a mouthful, but I was trying the best way to summarize this, but difficult because it is a big project. It began in 2018, but due to COVID-19 and other issues, the launch of the project was actually finalized by 2020-2021, and this effort was generously supported by the National Heritage Board, and it was sparked by the ultimate aim to preserve Silat heritage of as many Silat groups I can find. All right, so this is something which is quite wondrous because somehow we pulled it off. The project in the process eventually included groups from Sulawesi, Indonesia. Why? Because they have very strong historical and cultural connections to Singapore and the region. Assisted by my research assistant, Mr. Faisal Nordin, the process of interviewing many Silat teachers and recording their moves have led to new questions about Singapore's history. And of course, new insights into the historical development of the Malay community of Singapore. Ultimately, the project has allowed me to better understand the nature and degree of agency that the Malay community in Singapore had in the historical context. We always talk about how Singapore Malays have been victims of history, but once you look at Singapore Malays from the perspective of martial arts, a different picture emerges. And one of the major discoveries that I made during the project was uncovering new perspectives to the Johor Riau Lingga Empire of the 19th century, especially the role of the Sulewatang in traditional courts before their demise in the 19th century. That's not the best part. The best part is the descendants of these Bugis fighters today in Singapore and throughout the region. They still remember what they did in traditional courts, and that's the next phase of my project, to get as much memory recorded as possible from these groups. And this picture here is, of course, Mr. Razali from Kembang Wali, and that's Faisal interviewing Professor John Meksik as part of an interview. And these are very amazing people that we have managed to interview and get because they are just so open and willing to share their knowledge with us. But firstly, I must discuss the idea of mapping. I didn't realize it at first until last week when Jamal created the title for the talk today. And indeed, the project was an attempt to map the Silat groups of Singapore. However, what does mapping really mean? For cartographers, mapping is a process of graphically representing a geographical area. And in this, what is represented on the map are also political, cultural divisions of a geographical area. In other words, the cartographer reproduces the landscape as he or she understands it and includes in it communities, cultures that inhabit it, and complete with demarcations, of course, that define them. Now, in this sense, my work in mapping Silat groups is also similar. There are many Silat groups in Singapore, and many of them have unique and they are distinct cultural communities that originate from different regions throughout the region, such as Sulawesi, Java, Sumatra, Malaysia, etc. When one culturally maps them, it really unearthed the vibrant kaleidoscope that made up the foundations of the Singapore Malay community today. And once you culturally map them, the long history of cultural interactions between Silat groups in the region and in Singapore is very, very obvious to see. And these interactions have resulted in very interesting fusions of Silat cultures and mentalities. For example, the Silat Bawean community have interesting adaptations of Eastern Indonesian forms of swordsmanship, and that have resulted in the development of very aesthetic versions of the art. Hence, cultural mapping of Silat groups have led to new understandings of how Silat communities in Singapore have interacted and exchanged ideas throughout history. And this interaction is crucial to the development of new cultures and even identities. And one finds more about the process with the cultural mapping of Silat groups in Singapore. So as you can see the picture there, it is a demonstration of Pencak Silat, which uses a sword of the Bawean community, and this is quite amazing to see. And if you want to see more of Bawean swordsmanship skills, just go to Roots SG and look for the groups that have these skills, and it's all on Roots SG. Right? So in your free time, please do look for them. Now, mapping the Silat groups culturally also resulted in new understandings of how well Silat groups have adapted to major shifts in Singapore society, especially the fast-paced modernization of living spaces. The Singapore of old was filled with villages or kampong, and this was where many Singaporeans lived in the past. However, with the development of modern housing, Singaporeans quickly shifted to living in flats, and this was a major change for many Malay villages and represented a major challenge to Silat groups, as many have their gelanggangs or traditional training areas in the village. And we also found out that apart from just the gelanggang, many Silat groups of old also placed particular importance in respecting shrines or keramat. So once the village is gone, the associations with the old gelanggang and keramats are gone, and this is very traumatic to some groups in Singapore. However, when one does a cultural mapping of Silat groups, we can see that many Silat groups have made a successful transition to training in the community centers, or CCs. And this is a very important development, as the continuation of Silat cultures and knowledge is upheld. And today, many Silat groups train in CCs, community centers throughout Singapore. Therefore, even though many Malay villages, the gelanggangs and the keramats are gone, even though in the process of modernization of these living spaces, many Silat groups are still able to continue their training in new areas in the CC, and some even train in private spaces in their own homes in HDB flats. However, this raises an interesting question, which will form the basis of the presentation throughout today. How do we further explain the continued legacy of survival of Silat schools in Singapore? Now, firstly, it has a lot to do with the teachers of the Silat schools who ultimately determine the degree of the success that a group is able to attain. In my interviews and research with many Silat gurus, we met many progressive-minded, effective, and forward-looking Silat teachers who set out not only to become Silat teachers, but cultural leaders as well. And they aim to teach their students important ethical and moral values that are encoded in a particular Silat style. Now, many of these teachers owe their Silat learning to charismatic and good teachers, which they emulate today. And there are many examples to this. For example, Pak Amja of Macan Pasra, who still represent a source of great inspiration to his students, Mr. Sumaleki and Mr. Yazid in the audience today. And the late Dato' Mio and his student Hussein Kaslan from Gayung Pasar, they are also very interesting in terms of relationship, because Hussein Kaslan definitely saw in Dato' Mio more than just a guide, but a teacher of ethics and morality associated with martial art practice. And of course, the late Haji Lek Mokti from Sunda Pajajaran is also something very important, upheld as an example by the present-day teachers in that school. And of course, the late Tok Yasin, the originator of Amanca to Masjid style, which is now taught by his grandson, Mr. Fazal Nordin. And of course, who can forget the late Ramli Awi, the father of Rafili Ramli of Seligi Tunggal Angkatan. These early teachers have a common understanding that Silat practice is essential in teaching resilience, and more importantly, provide the mental structures to overcome insurmountable challenges with courage, fortitude, and honor. The impact of these great teachers can really be seen in interviews with the present-day Silat teachers of today, especially Mr. Fazal Nordin, whose grandfather, Tok Yasin, taught him the meaning of Siri in Bugis, which is, it means in honor in Bugis, and it is something unassailable in Bugis culture. And also once we interview Mr. Rafili Ramli, and once he discusses what his father taught him, his father really impressed upon Mr. Rafili the importance of displaying courage even in the toughest of circumstances. With that in mind, Rafili became world champion, and he beat probably the best Silat fighters around in the Silat competitions around the world. Hence, the continuity of Silat schools in Singapore can be explained. It was really the teachers who believed in the virtues of courage and resilience, and this became effective models to overcome difficult circumstances and challenges. As you can see, Mr. Sumaleki in his, I can't do this because it's very, very flexible. Yeah, so this is a very flexible Mr. Sumaleki to your left there, the Macam Pasra, and this is Mr. Rafili, who demonstrates very vigorously Bawian swordsmanship styles in Seligi Tunggal Angkatan. However, there is another reason that I would like to explore. I hypothesize that Silat groups evaded scrutiny and control during the colonial period, and this led to many Silat groups preserving pre-colonial mentalities and cultures that lend further strength to their resilience and continued survival. But why did the colonial authorities do not give attention to Silat groups during the colonial period? There are many possible reasons for this. Firstly, it could be that the colonial authorities were much more concerned with the Chinese triads in Singapore, Chinese secret societies. Not only were they very well organized, they were also well trained in forms of Chinese martial arts still unknown today. And this capacity to fight, this training that they had, resulted in massive clashes between triads vying for control, and this resulted, if you look through the colonial reportage, in the death and injuries of many members of the colonial police force. Triads, therefore, are a source of great concern because they can destabilize colonial society in those days. However, the event that caused the greatest concern with the colonial authorities were the Hokkien Teochew riots of 1854, which greatly embarrassed the colonial authorities as they failed to contain it quickly. After this massive riot, much suspicion was cast on activities of Chinese triads, and this included greater police attention. A good example was the appointment of William Pickering in 1877 to establish greater communication, hence lessening a conflict that the colonial authorities have with the triads in Singapore. And of course, this was a way to improve relations, right? However, no similar attention was given to the Silat groups in the similar period. They were likely not seen as a threat. As you can see in the picture here, the National Library Board has written amazing work on triads, all right? And you can see how, from this picture alone, how wealthy and well-organized secret society bosses were in those days, all right? So this picture is very emblematic of the struggles that early colonial authorities had with the Chinese triads. With the lack of scrutiny and control, it is very likely that Silat groups in Singapore of the various Javanese, Sundanese, Boyanese, Bugis, and Sumatran groups were able to continue Silat practice in the villages without much interference by colonial authorities. It is also very likely that the colonial authorities found Silat practitioners very useful, and evidence of this can be found during the Hokkien Teochew riots of 1854, where, interestingly enough, colonial authorities asked for Bugis fighters to quell the violence. Perhaps this collaboration left a good impression of Silat practitioners on the British, who subsequently left them alone. And this could be explained in how Tok Yassin's father taught him Bugis Silat in the late 19th century in the village of Pasir Panjang in the colonial period with very little colonial interference. Hence, there was some advantage at not being mapped or surveilled by colonial authorities. But ultimately, Silat groups in Singapore remain invisible and therefore unknown. But the situation changed dramatically in the 1950s and 60s, and these periods were crucial to understand the legacy of continued survival of Silat schools in Singapore. Silat groups were largely ignored during the colonial period. That is what I mentioned just now. But during the turbulent periods of the 1950s, especially with the riots, violent riots, and these are not just riots, violent riots caused by the Maria Herto issue, these events began a search by some members in the Malay community to learn Silat. This was mentioned in the National Archive interview conducted with the late Hussein Kaslan, the leader of Gayung Pasar then, who said that he was inspired to learn Silat with Dato' Meo, as he wanted to learn skills to protect his family after witnessing the terrible violence in the riots of the period. As you can see in the picture here, the riots caused by the Maria Herto issue is quite violent, all right? A lot of contentment growing on. And somehow, members of the Malay community began to search for Silat schools to learn martial arts skills from. And this picture came from 1957, all right, to your left. This is where Dato' Meo, seen there with the tanjak there, has experienced an exponential growth in student membership, all right? So fear and uncertainty really led to an increase of membership numbers for Silat groups in Singapore during the 1950s. The fear and in uncertain times propelled Silat groups to become teachers, more than just teachers, they got to handle people as well. So you need to invent uniforms, you need to create syllabuses, structures of teaching. So with riots and the fear caused by uncertainty, you see in the 1950s, Silat groups becoming more organized. And this is a great example from Silat Gayung, that they were among the most earliest groups that took advantage of these opportunities. Right? Another example, same school, Silat Gayung, to illustrate further that climates of fear and uncertainty really made Silat teaching much more available to the masses, happened in Pulau Sudong in 1942. Villagers of Pulau Sudong feared being attacked by the Japanese, asked Datuk Meo to teach them Silat, and this led to the earliest groups of students in Singapore on Pulau Sudong, the earliest students of this school. More research needs to be done, but there is a clear connection with how fear and uncertainty led to active searches for martial arts skills. And this can be considered to be a reason for the continued survival of Silat schools in Singapore. Fear and uncertainty can also be factors that allow Silat teachers in their schools to be mapped onto the consciousness of the community more. Another important factor for explaining the legacy of continued survival in Silat schools in Singapore is the rise of movie companies such as the Shaw Brothers and categories in the 50s and 60s who produced movies that needed Silat experts. This was the case for Haji Arthid, the teacher of the Bandagan Asli style. According to an interview Mr. Irwan conducted in 2020, his father was talent spotted in 1963 by categories, a major film producer in the period, during a Silat competition. Haji Arthid was offered a role in a Silat scene on the movie Air Mata Doyong. As you can see from the illegal screenshot that I made, right, to your right here. Right, so we can see Silat practitioners of the Seligi Tunggal style basically becoming actors for this movie. And this was also the case for Dato' Meo of Silat Gayung, who trained famous actresses such as Kasma Buti. Actually, I'm too young for this. Yeah? Kasma Buti was a very important Malay actress in the period, and she is seated to the extreme right. And once Kasma Buti was trained in Silat for her movies, it basically made her much more popular. However, what was the appeal of Silat practitioners for the movie industry in Singapore? It is clear that directors producing and directing movies based on readings of sources, such as the Sejarah Melayu and various hikayats, found that the only way to replicate battles and duels described in these sources was to use the direct inheritors of ancient Malay martial arts knowledge, that is, the Silat practitioners themselves. Hence, the Silat teachers and their students found a new way to remap themselves onto the silver screen this time by reenacting the very historical roles that they once played for the kerajaans or kingdoms of old as fighters or protectors of rulers. Remapping, or the ability to adapt to new circumstances, was a crucial factor that explained why Silat Gayung Pasak's continued existence until recently. All right? From the interviews of Hussein Kaslan again, which can be found in the National Archives, and his old students, it is very clear the early members wanted to be recognized by the British military in the 1960s. And this led to very important changes in how Silat Gayung members were trained. The new syllabus, with great influence by the British military system, began to emphasize greater physical training to produce Silat practitioners that were not only physically impressive, they looked good, but they were able to perform amazing physical feats, endure more, and do more arduous martial arts skills that often stunned the audience. And the group's ability to remap themselves as useful and important component of British military training in Singapore led to Silat Gayung becoming one of the most popular groups in the 70s, even the 80s. Many, like I said just now, were stunned by the physical prowess of the members, and this led to an explosion of membership during the 80s and even the 90s. However, the ability of Silat schools to remap themselves onto new consciousness did not just occur with the British. Silat Gayong members, because of their martial prowess, because of their new enhanced syllabus to produce supermen, allowed them to map themselves onto the national consciousness of Singapore by becoming symbols of progress, modernity, and cultural success when Singapore just became independent. It was Silat Gayong Pasak's participation in the National Day parades of the 60s and 70s and their amazing displays of martial prowess, strict discipline, and showcases of extreme physical excellence that made the group becoming useful emblems of the new fledgling nation. The Silat practitioners, by becoming Singapore's symbols, demonstrated usefully that Singapore was not only a young nation, it was also a spirited one that had vigor and fearlessness of the Pendekas of old. In other words, the group's success in remapping themselves onto new national consciousness explained the continued survival of Silat schools in Singapore, especially Silat Gayong. This is continued today with similar ways in which successful Pesilat of Singapore from many other perguruans won many international and regional sports Silat competitions. Similar to the Gayong of old, Pesilat today continue to remap the Malay community onto vibrant and new vistas of success. But the Pesilat today remaps more than just new consciousness. They provide they gave the Singapore Malay community a crucial and much needed vocabulary and language of victory. For many Silat groups that we have interviewed, surrender and defeatism are enemies that must be defeated. Many want the Singapore Malay community to succeed, and many want to participate in the work of rehabilitation, empowerment, and strengthening the young to become emblems of new progress and new ambitions for the nation. In other words, Silat groups of today in Singapore are in a unique position to visualize new maps of progress for the community while staying true to old and honored codes of ethics and morality that defined Pendekas of old. And with that, I end the presentation, and now for a short demonstration by the Silat Gayong team.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Effendy, and thank you, Silat Seni Gayung Pasak, for that demonstration. We're not doing one, huh?
Saya belakang.
No, okay. All right. Thank you for your sharing. I'd like to bring up the QR code again, just to remind everyone that if you do have a question to us, and especially if you're here and you want to remain anonymous, you can ask your question through the QR code, through our Slido app. For those at home, you can also post your questions on the same platform, and I'll get them here. As we wait for you guys to do that, let me just warm Dr. Effendy up with a few of my own questions. Just now, earlier on in your presentation, there was, you mentioned there was a move post-independence from the kampong to HDB flats, and that led to the loss of the gelanggang and also the sacred sites. I would like to know, because obviously both are very important, so you need to find a suitable place to practice for the gelanggang. So they adapted to the community centers. But what about the sacred sites, the kramat themselves? Well, how did they move beyond, the sites from their kampong? Did they have to find alternatives to that, or did they adapt in another way?
From the information that I got based on interviews, the transition wasn't that hard. These groups are very mobile, all right? They needed space, so I think that makes Singapore Silat groups quite unique, very pragmatic in their decisions for training places. The sacred place, of course, is important, but more importantly is finding the right venue for training, to continue training for their members, all right? Even though there is some sense of loss associated with the movement from traditional gelanggangs or training grounds to new ones, of course, yeah? But this is taken matter of factly. It is something like all groups realize, most of the groups realize that this is a feature of modernization, that we have to adapt, all right? We cannot just pine for a long lost area anymore. This impedes training. More importantly is to produce per Silat of skill. So that's why I think this transition is not that traumatic for some groups that I observe.
Which led me to the next question, because when you transition from the kampong to flats, and then also from the village gelanggang to community centers, I imagine that there has to be some form of registration, right? So groups would have to register their activities, either as a society or otherwise. Was this process compulsory? Did all groups go through this process? Did we lose any Silat groups during this transition because of whatever?
To answer you directly, based on interviews that I've done with a lot of gurus, yes, there seems to be a lot of groups that do not want to be registered, right? Because of this is the complex thing that I'm still trying to uncover more. If you register yourself with the Martial Arts Control Unit, all right, you must be able to pay for certain things. You must
pay.
Pay for registration and so on and so forth. And some of these groups are not really well funded. And the second thing is that they must invent new names for themselves. Initially, before the advent of registration, some groups exist just as styles, right? With very little mention of name that describe those styles. They know of their origins, that is Sunda, Java, so on and so forth. But coming up with a name which is agreeable to everybody is very difficult. All right, so this is why this is the insight to the complexities of identity making among Silat groups in the 60s and 70s as they try to define themselves. It is very difficult, all right, because this is where it becomes very crucial to understand the role of the leader here, right, in deciding what kind of name that we like, and we shall pursue it, right, to maintain this name and to use this name as part of a registration process. And this is something, surprisingly, what I found out, not easy to do. Right, there is a lot of resistance, all right, by other teachers within that Silat school to that name. So it causes fragmentation, it causes certain, vicious rivalries to erupt. However, the groups that we see today are at the end processes of, stable methods of identity making, identity formation. Somehow, the leaders, again, are able to convince their group, their members, that this is the name that we will adhere to, and therefore they manage to register themselves successfully. But again, some teachers feel that by registering themselves, they are opening up themselves to more visibility by the state. So this is something which pauses.
Why is that a concern, though?
Because for some groups, not all, some groups, they feel that their practices, their art must be kept hidden, must be secret, all right? It is only meant for a certain group of people, their family members usually, and this is a real problem, all right, that determines whether a Silat group wants to be registered or not. And this is what I said, you know, there are some groups that are lost because they do not want to be registered. But not registering means that you immediately go extinct. No.
So there are
Yes.
groups in existence that are not registered.
That's right. And what we learned from an example of Faizal Nordin's school is that, you know, for a long time, his grandfather does not want to teach that art to others. Keep it within a family, basically. So this basically keeps the group effectively as an invisible community, basically. And then the group became visible once Faizal started to think about registering, being an official member in an organization. But again, you make yourself visible. Right? And this is something which, you know, some groups in the past have contemplated whether to register or not and how much visibility I want for my group.
The other adaptation I would like to highlight is Silat used to be quite personal, could exist within a certain community perhaps. But once you move to being registered within community centers, performing in National Day parades, of course being part of nation building itself, Silat also is now something that you compete in you know, SEA Games or Olympics or World Championships. So was there any, in your research, groups that were okay leading towards this new model of activities, and are there those that reject that, and why would they have rejected
Some
it?
were quite hesitant to engage in the new version of Silat, sports Silat basically, means olahraga. Means that, you know, you go, you train and you engage in competition, you don't hurt the other, you get points, right? One tendangan, they serve several points, one pukulan, 1 point. So some teachers, you know, seem to be hesitant initially. And this comes from the early reports that the Berita Harian has done. From the 60s onwards. The reporters themselves were quite curious about this transition, that, you know, that sports Silat required of these practitioners of traditional Silat, which is you train to become Pendekar, which means that you basically have knowledge of very deadly skills to hurt, to maim, to kill, so on and so forth. So the initial reaction of a lot of early groups at that point of time in the 60s and early 70s was that, how do I make my martial art, which is basically designed for that endeavor, traditional warfare, to be suitable for the sports, all right? So this is something which, you know, some teachers have a lot of interesting issues with. But eventually, they adapted to it. They managed to develop syllabuses that cater as well to sports Silat initiatives, sports Silat agendas, right? This is something which is quite remarkable, because if you look at the history of the sportification of martial arts throughout the world, especially in Northeast Asia, with Korea and Japan, especially in how to transform their Koryu or Budo arts into something much safer, that's also, that side of the world met a lot of resistance, right? However, once the sport version of a martial art gains ground in terms of giving success, material success, cultural, social success to the practitioner who brings home medals, somehow it eases off tensions. Somehow it makes a transition from traditional martial arts to sports one much more palatable to some. However, till today, of course, this view is not shared, all right? Because there are arguments now that to transform my martial arts school into a complete sports one would delimit and negate my traditional systems. So this is a fear now, all right? So by some teachers. However, we need to strike a balance, all right? Because if you can still have traditional martial arts and sports version of martial arts at the same time. Both can work with each other.
Thank you. Okay, we have questions piling in. They're all anonymous. Thank you. So first, some of the swords featured in your slides look like European swords. Do Silat groups explicitly talk about the influences they have accepted from the West? Yeah, that's one question.
Okay. Yeah. Surprisingly, the origins of these weapons, especially the swords that are used by the Bawean Silat groups in Singapore, a lot of them have very mixed ideas about their origins. But my hypothesis is this. You have to look at the penetration of the Iberians in Southeast Asia from the 17th century onwards, especially the Dutch. The Dutch were quite active in eastern Indonesia, and they deployed their forces as well to engage local forces. So I'm very sure that the locals observe what the Europeans are wearing to the battlefield and in conflict, and among them are European-style swords. All right. So now that's the point for which more research is done. More research is needed to be done. At one point for which is there any evidence to show that there is one fighter, local fighter from the battlefield picked up a European sword and copied it? Basically, that could likely happen as well, but we don't know.
Actually, during the colonial period, I mean, we do have artifacts of what appears to be Southeast Asian swords, but actually got the VOC symbol down there, right? It's because it was adapted, lah. So they were probably fighting the Dutch, and then someone took the sword as a souvenir and then fashioned it to look like more indigenous sword.
That's
so
right.
that definitely happens.
And to that, there is a long pattern of localization of external ideas from outside Southeast Asia. And this is something that has been going on in Southeast Asia for a very long time. How do we use something from outside our culture to make it our own? So this forms the grounds for which, that Dutch-looking sword or European-looking saber, basically, is used by a Bawean Silat community in Singapore.
Okay, next question. Currently, is there a difference between the usual Silat we normally see and any ethnic or kaum-centric type of Silat? Were there any specific differences back then? I think this is about style attached to a particular community, perhaps. Yeah.
Interesting question, and I would like to engage this. Interviews with the many Silat groups in Singapore have given me new insights to engage this question. Somehow the styles in Singapore, the various Silat styles in Singapore, especially the Bawean styles, are regarded by some in the Bawean community in Indonesia to be much older, to be much more authentic to older forms of Silat. So this is very interesting, the discussions with Guru Silat, I forgot his name. He mentioned that once he goes back to Bawean Island, all right, to demonstrate what he knows about his art, it's amazing because the gurus there say that this is an original style of Bawean swordsmanship that we have not seen for quite a while. So this is something which is interesting because it points out to legacies of migration to Singapore. All right, what we know now is that in the early and mid 19th century, because Singapore opened up as a very successful free port by the British, it led to many migrants coming to Singapore. And a lot of these migrants have martial skills from particular areas in the region, Bawean, Sulawesi, Java, so on and so forth. And they bring to Singapore what they know at that point of time of a martial arts system, right, at a particular point of time. And these systems are taught in Singapore, all right? So this is why I think, we see a difference in the styles in Singapore. Some gurus throughout Southeast Asia, sometimes they see this style and say, this is very old style practice in Singapore. We have not been seeing this style for quite a while in our villages in Indonesia.
So in a way, the group that left and came to Singapore preserved that art form?
I think it's likely, based on the information that we have, yes. I think it's likely that a lot of these migrants to Singapore brought heritage which existed at a particular point of time. So this heritage in Singapore didn't change.
And so they persevered to preserve it as it is. Okay.
That's right.
Okay. Bell, someone decided to show me their name. Hi Bell, thanks. Do you think state involvement in regulation of Silat groups is more of a pro or a con? Personally, I can see how it goes both ways, but I want to hear your thoughts.
So far, it has been of course, mixed reactions, by some communities in the Silat community. That what is the meaning of state involvement in this? You tell me. More surveillance. You got to register means you make your activities more visible. You need to create your syllabus, and that syllabus has to be overseen by somebody upstairs. So a lot of managing of these groups. But again, looking at the progress made by Silat groups today, all right, because they had a syllabus, because they had registered, they are allowed avenues to train within Singapore, and they're not seen as in any way as a threat to communities. It makes training safer because they have a syllabus, and it makes the process of growing much better, right? Which contrasts before registration, the time before registration, before the time for which Silat groups create syllabuses. Training was ad hoc. It is very, very personal based. You see, so once you have a system in place to train, it leads to better outcomes for the trainer and trainee. So this is what I would say to bell them. And again, there is some benefits to modernization. Of course, the critical aspect to this answer is that how much modernization you want. Will we lose our authenticity in the process of being too modernized? So that's always find a balancing act always.
Dr. Saiful, do you want to ask a question? Sorry, let me pass you my microphone because we're recording this. Cannot hear you.
Yeah, first things first, I'd like to thank Dr. Effendy for a very excellent lecture, and really thank you for your research, in this area, which really you are breaking new ground because there's no such research, I think, in Singapore. And I think previously when we were doing the book, I think we took about a year, and there was a lot of trials and tribulations, right? So I think just for my question, in your sense travels, in your research, so how many Silat styles do you estimate are there in Singapore? Okay, are there those that's underground, those that do not want to be registered, and what were your challenges? I think in terms of trying to draw these Silat gurus to share the knowledge, and can anything more be done?
In our project, we managed to record and interview, say, 30 plus in Silat groups in Singapore. Of course, if you just take a look that agree to consent to be interviewed and recorded, I think I'm hypothesizing here, that's just 10% of what is available in Singapore, right? So that's what I always wonder about the families in Singapore that still practice secret types of martial arts meant only for the family. All right, that's one segment that I think me and Faisal, failed to engage a bit more, because, like I say, families want to keep their inherited styles secret. They do not want to teach others beyond the family. So I guess we accept that situation, and I think so the groups that are receptive to being recorded and interviewed, those like I say, are very valuable to us, because what they record and what they demonstrate for the NHB project gets preserved forever. All right, and you and I know how fragile our martial art heritage is in Southeast Asia. It is just so easy to lose. All right, especially with the many factors for it to be easily lost. The sudden death of a guru, the sudden deaths of students, the increased rivalries, factionalism basically within a group. All these are detriments to preservation, because it does not create an environment for sharing. All right, and if sharing is asked of these groups, it will lead to ideas that you are stealing our knowledge, you are engaging you are interested in furthering our rivalries by sharing our knowledge with the enemy, so on and so forth. A lot of fear is involved. Yeah. So this is what me and Faisal faced in the process of our research. But the groups that agreed to be interviewed by us, recorded, we really, really sanjung, meaning we really respect and honor their contributions, which is why we hope to do more. And but maybe I will do it, but tired, so maybe get somebody else to do, future researcher.
All right. There's two questions on this one, so I'll just put them together. First, it's shorter one. How is Silat viewed by other racial groups, for example, Chinese people? The other question is, you said Silat became the symbol of Singapore's success. However, most of the Silat players are Malay. Is Silat accepted by the whole nation? I guess the question seems to be leading towards, are Silat practitioners exclusively Malays, or are they also open to non-Malays participating in them?
I think the majority of the perguruans in Singapore are open to non-Malays practicing in their art form, all right? That's what I observe, and which is a very, very positive development, because the realities of living in Singapore, it is a multi-ethnic nation, all right? We accept expertise and interested students from all backgrounds, of course, and this is a very good way to go about it. But I think the first question is very intriguing. The question is, are there any, engagements? Are there any interactions, is it? Okay, let me engage. If I can remember that question, were there any evidence of interactions between different communities or martial art groups of other communities?
How is Silat perceived by other communities?
Okay, this is one thing that I found out with interviewing the senior gurus, is that apparently there is a lot of respect that goes on with other non-Malay practitioners of martial arts, yeah? I'm talking about the karate community, I'm talking about the kendo community, I'm talking about Chinese martial arts community, and all of them, amazingly, have a great respect for Malay martial arts. Right? This is what I think that I got from the interviews with the senior gurus, meaning that, there was, once upon a time, a climate of sharing and curiosity. That's the best part here. Gurus, teachers of all martial arts are very interested to know what's the other side teaching. All right? And therefore, it sets the establishment of communication. And one example I think I remember that I shared by Mr. Razali, the head of Kemang Wali Silat Group, was that, among his best friends were the old sifus, right? That want to communicate with him, that shared with him their art, because they are interested to know what Razali knows about his art, the Javanese central styles. Quite amazing. And I think, this must be pursued further in terms of research, because somehow they communicate in Malay, and this is something which is very, very important as well. How was communication established? What was discussed? And more importantly, did it lead to hybridity of styles between communities? And this is something intriguing as well, and quite an amazing find that we discovered in the project. There is a hybridization of Kuntao styles in Singapore, all right? There is an idea that you can mix together, hybridize Southern Chinese martial art forms into a Malay system. This has been done before, all right, to some degree of success. So we have groups like Kuntao Asli, all right, that's one group. There are other groups as well that practice that localized understandings of Chinese martial arts, and this is not just happening in Singapore, but throughout Southeast Asia as well. And what we found out in Sulawesi was that, Chinese migrants from southern China go to parts in eastern Indonesia to teach their versions of martial art, right? We don't know exactly what these Chinese martial arts form are about, but once my Kung Fu friends watch, the particular clip which contains hybridized forms of martial art, it is very obvious. They say this is Malay hands, but Chinese feet, or Malay feet, Chinese hands. You see, these very interesting localizations and hybridizations of different cultural forms of martial arts in Southeast Asia. So again, this is very complex terrain, really, of research. And if you want to go about to do research, be my guest, but it is very exciting because there's a lot of absorption of Northeast Asian styles into Southeast Asia in many areas around the region.
I imagine you'd have to have some very deep technical knowledge of the art form itself for you to make those kind of analysis. And as a researcher, do you think you have those technical knowledge?
Of course not. Of course not. This is why making friends is important. This is why discussing your findings with teachers is very important. I have regular conversations with teachers from kendo and some karate. So this is something very interesting that, once, of course from Chinese martial arts ground, and this is something very essential for me because, ideas don't exist in isolation. They must be shared with, interacted with, and they must be critiqued. Right? So this is something which is very valuable for me in terms of interaction with other martial art practitioners. They are curious themselves to know what are these styles all about and how they become that way. Right? So this is something which triggers natural curiosity in all the most of the people that I met during this research. Right?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so there's the next one. How is the Silat scene in Singapore adapting itself to make itself relevant to the current generation? Do you see challenges for the Silat scene to continue flourishing?
I can't answer the first part. The second part, I can engage.
Okay.
Right, okay, this is Persis's maybe they can
Okay.
answer better.
We will forward your question to Persisi to respond.
Right. The second part is how do we maintain progress?
How do you see challenges to Silat scene to continue flourishing?
Okay, one obvious challenge that I observe, this is coming from my personal thoughts on this, all right? The material that Silat groups in Singapore work with, the Malay population needs a bit of improvement, all right? Meaning that, you know, standards of discipline have differed across generations, yeah? And this is something of a challenge to a lot of, not just Silat groups, yeah, but across the board. Martial art groups in Singapore, that the generations of students today is a bit different from the 80s, 60s, and 70s. For example, a very clear example was shared with me with my friend in Kenjutsu. We say that, you know, students of all don't ask questions about what the training is about. They keep to it, no matter how painful it is, because no matter how painful it is, they stick to it. And this is the student of all. The new one is a bit different. There is much more, less acceptance of rigorous and painful methods of training. And I guess, you know, students, as mentioned by some martial arts teachers that I know of, not just Silat, the new generation somehow is exposed to media more, all right? They want to perform like Samurai X. They want to become Mat Kilau. They want to become, you know, to immediately perform like what they see on TV, the fantasy, of course, without realizing that it takes a long time, a lot of training to reach that stage, all right? Sometimes years, sometimes many, many years, all right? So the McDonaldization of training, meaning that, you know, you pay this amount, you get what you want in terms of gratification, is something that worries a lot of martial arts teachers in Singapore, not just the Silat gurus today, right? So the challenge is how do they engage or train these groups of students, this new generation of students today who have very different thinking about what is training, the meaning of training, and how much effort to put in it, right?
No, I think it's not just Silat, right? I think you see it in national service as well. So once upon a time you could push, kick, and whatever your soldiers. Now you have push-up pads, right? So, yeah.
Push-up pads?
Yeah, they do. They have these pads for push-ups.
What?
So you don't hurt your hands. So yeah, hey. We need to toughen them up somehow without kicking or pushing them.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I think, Karen, your question we've somewhat addressed earlier, just now with regards to moving from kampong to HDB flats and about syncretism of Silat groups. So definitely that exists. The next one is, as Silat originated from Malaysia and Indonesia, are there any Islamic influences to the philosophy behind Silat? What philosophical principles underpin Silat?
Can't answer that, really.
Can't answer that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Meaning that, you know, I need to do more research on this, of course.
But I think by large, there are Silat practitioners, predominantly being Malay Muslims, will have some elements of, religious elements involved in it. To what degree, I think that belongs to the individual groups, and how much Islam influences the individual also, I think, is quite dependent on their understanding of it. So, yeah. I'm going to ask a naughty question next. And this might be the last one. Silat has multiple facets. So you have your philosophy, you have the physical aspect, and then you have your spiritual aspect, right? Just now you mentioned that after the racial riots, there were people who went to study Silat, and hopefully they will get kebatinan, right? Where they would be, how would I translate batin? Basically, inner prowess, where, you know, you throw sword also nothing happen, right? Kana shoot by bullet also you okay one, right? How much of that thinking still exists within the current Silat generation today? And how much is that still incorporated within their practice? And if that is still such an important aspect of modern Silat?
Based on the interviews that we've done, the gurus and the observations of many Silat practitioners of these schools, there's very little of that now. Right? I think the trend is, you know, to move away from these practices and to focus more on sport Silat versions of the Silat. But of course, everybody realizes that keeping traditional aspects of it is still important, but what tradition, right? So, but again, even though there is a lack of emphasis on kebatinan practices in Singapore, in Malaysia, Indonesia, and other parts of Southeast Asia, all right, it is very different, all right? So, if students in Singapore want the taste of these practices or understand, or even just look at it, borders around Southeast Asia are open to students of martial art practitioners, and they can observe these practices outside Southeast Asia. Problem is if they want to bring it back or not.
Yeah.
Right, so that's always something which is very curious, and I think the climate, what I observe, correct me if I'm wrong, Guru Silat di sini, that it is not emphasized anymore, like in the past, kebatinan practices, right? Yeah.
The reason I ask is because I think if we were to look at very traditional forms of Malay cultural practices, either in performance or martial arts, there's always that element, right? There's always the ritualistic element where you address the spirit. So when we look at something like Kuda Kepang, for example, which has the trance element, which is very sensitive to audiences in Singapore, and they face that challenge, that perception that, oh, okay, if you do this, it's haram or shirik, etc. So I imagine Silat, once upon a time, had that kind of public perception as well.
This was attested to by colonial observations, yeah? I'm talking about 17th century Dutch observations of how the Bugis fight in Sulawesi. There's a lot of invulnerability going on, all right? There's a lot of mantra going on when Bugis fighters fight in Sulawesi against each other, against the Dutch. This is what the Dutch observed, this is what the British observed as well, and Silat communities in Malaysia, or Malaya, once upon a time, all right? Invulnerability, practices of kebatinan to achieve invulnerability, meaning that people shoot you, the bullet bounce off, okay, that kind of thinking. Right, so this went on. What the colonial powers have observed, and that's doing records, so that it did went on during the colonial period, but there are certain changes in Southeast Asia, especially about communities' understandings about what is acceptable or not in terms of culture and social practices. That took place around the 70s and 80s. For which these practices that of kebatinan and invulnerability began to slowly change, right? But again, more research needed.
Okay, definitely one last question. Do you have a slide showing the Silat mapping that you've done?
Silat mapping I've done?
Yeah.
I do not have one right now.
Yes. This is where you pitch the website.
Oh, yes. Oh, okay. Thanks for it. Me and Faisal have done a lot of work to map, all right, these groups onto the Roots SG website, and it is all there. Groups in Singapore and Sulawesi are all there. The interviews and moves, the videos that we recorded of them, all nicely edited and in the Roots SG website. Okay, so I do not have the hyperlink now, but if you go to Roots SG and type in search for Silat, Singapore, or Bugis, those kind of keywords, it will stumble onto the vast collection of stuff that me and Faisal have prepared for you guys, for your intellectual consumption. So,
okay, I go on Roots at Z, what can I see? How many Silat groups are there? What about the Silat group I can see?
You see a mixture, a panoply of cultural, Silat styles from Sulawesi, Java, Bawean, and even from Sumatra as well, the Minangkabau, Harimau Minangkabau styles is amazing. That's from Singapore alone, but if you transit to the Sulawesi page of sorts, you will see groups from Makassar in Bone, and all these groups have memories, connections to either trade or fighting in Southeast Asia and in Singapore. So this is something which, the part A of the project, which is connecting to Sulawesi, first Singapore, Sulawesi. Maybe if I live long enough, I focus on Singapore and Java. Right, so Javanese Silat groups are also very numerous. They have a lot of memory of Singapore as well, all right? So maybe that will happen one day, and Sumatra as well, and of course, Malaysia, Singapore as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Effendy. That's a lot of research done. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and comments. It is a very huge project, and I applaud you and your team for doing it. And I hope all of you here or watching at home, please go check it out on roots.sg. There's a lot of information that you can use, learn from, and maybe hopefully it might inspire you young researchers to do a bit more and contribute to it, right? Okay, that's it for us today. Thank you once again, and thank you, Dr. Effendy.
Thank you, Mr. Jamal.
And have a good weekend. Assalamualaikum. Sorry, I always forget this part. QR code for feedback. Thank you very much. Yeah, so please scan the QR code. Do provide your feedback for today's talk, right? Appreciate it.